there was no one to disturb his sleep that night, and when he woke up he was no longer tired. He was not even cold, he was pleasantly warm, in fact. He lay awake for a while with his eyes shut, basking in the warmth of his own body, while he listened as usual for sounds about him. But all was quiet. Then, opening his eyes, he sat up and looked. David was familiar only with various tones of grey and brown, and of course the blue of the sky. Well, yes, he had once seen a little red flower that had strayed inside the camp wall. Apart from that, colour was something he'd only heard of. He'd only seen a pale and muddied reflection of it in the ugliness of the camp and the equally ugly quarters of the guards. He did not know how long he stayed there on the mountainside, sitting motionless, just gazing. Only when everything grew strangely misty did he discover that he was crying. Far below him lay the sea, a sea bluer than any sky he had ever seen. The land curved in and out along its edge, in and out, up and down, all green and golden, with here and there the red of flowers too far off to be clearly seen. Down by the sea a road ran along the foot of the mountain, and near it lay villages, whose bright colours gleamed dazzlingly. There were trees with many changing tints of green, and over it shone the warming sun, not white-hot and spiteful and scorching, as the sun had shone upon the camp in the summer-time, but with a warm golden loveliness. Beauty. David had once heard Johannes use the word. It must have been something like this he meant. Perhaps that was why he had come back and gone with him to Salonika, so that he, David, could sail across the sea till he came to a place where things were beautiful. His tears continued to flow, faster and faster, and he brushed them angrily away so that the mist before his eyes should not veil that beauty from him. Suddenly he knew that he did not want to die. He did not want to be caught. He did not want to die. His legs carried him to the place where the van stood waiting, and when the weight of loneliness had grown too much for him, Johannes kept him company to Salonika. The strange man with the black head of hair had helped him to reach land with a lifebelt, and now that he'd learned about beauty, he wanted to live. Chapter 2. For a long time, David continued to sit and gaze upon the beautiful scenery that lay before him. He looked again and again upon the blueness of the sea, upon the coastline curving along its shore. He saw the colours of the landscape, its many kinds of green, intermingled with gold and red, fade into one another towards the horizon, until everything melted into the blue of sea and sky far away over the mountains. David looked down at his own hand, lying in the grass, and knew at once what he was going to do first. The grass was green, although summer was far advanced. There must be water not very far away. He looked first at the sun, then at his compass, and then at the sun again. It was very early. He still had a good hour before he needed to find a hiding place for the day. He took hold of his bundle and jumped up, and there was water, a lazy little brook glinting in the sunlight in the midst of a much wider riverbed which wound among trees and bushes where he could hide if anyone came along. David had his clothes off in no time. He had only a shirt and a pair of trousers kept up with string. He laid his trousers in the water and put a stone on top to prevent them floating away. Then he soaked his shirt thoroughly and opened his bundle. He stood there for a moment, soap in hand. Sometimes, when they first arrived in camp, they were quite white and clean all over, with no smell about them. He hardly dared try. Then he made an attempt, beginning with his hands. It worked, almost. David scrubbed away until he was in a sweat. He picked up his shirt to rub himself with, and then he got on much better. He really thought dirt was much more difficult to get off. Then he remembered the sea. Being wet through all night must have helped considerably. His head was a bit of a problem, but David would not give up. He was going to get all that dirt off, all that reminded him of the camp and smelt of it. He lay right down, dipping his head in the water so that his hair was thoroughly wet. rubbed soap all over it until his arms grew tired, then ducked again and rubbed away with his shirt until his hair was no longer felt sticky. He turned cold, but he took no notice. His one thought was to be quite clean. His shirt gradually took on a brighter colour, and then he set about his trousers as well. They too became brighter. Finally he sat down with his knife and whittled away at a twig until he had a sharp point of clean wood. He pricked himself a couple of times in the process, but in the end even his toenails were clean. The sun glistened on a drop of water as it fell from his hand to his knee. David wiped it off, but it left no tide mark. There was no more dirt to rub away. He took a deep breath and shivered. He was David. Everything else was washed away. The camp, its smell, its touch, and now he was David, his own master, free as long as he could remain so. David took a look around. It would not do to go on sitting where he was. A little higher up the hill he caught sight of a house among the trees, and a little farther down lay the road. There would soon be people about, and he must first find a safe hiding place. He followed the stream a little way, then turned off and went straight down towards the coast. The going was steep, but David's thick soles were used to finding places where he could get a good foothold, and his body was lithe and quick, and he found no difficulty keeping his balance. Just before he came to the road, he stopped irresolutely. He could hide in the undergrowth down there, but that meant he would have to lie flat all day. And when he was not sleeping, it would be very irksome to lie in roughly the same position all the time. Now that he was close to the road, he could see that there were houses at regular intervals along both sides of it, not right on it, but a little above or below, with gates leading onto it. Beautiful houses, pink and pale yellow and white, with gaily painted doors and green trees and climbing plants growing on their walls. But where there were houses, there were people. A little farther on the ground fell away so steeply from the road that there were no houses for some distance. It looked as if it would cross over. His heart began to beat quickly. The road wound among the hills, and you could not see much of it at one time because it kept bending sharply around the spurs. Even if he was certain the road was clear at the moment, someone might just come along as he began to cross. Not cars, nor people walking on the hard surface, for David's hearing was good, but he would not be able to hear anyone walking on the grass verge until he was right on top of him. Was it all to last only a single morning? All the beauty, all his desire to live? Was it all to be taken from him again by a single stranger, now or in half an hour's time? But if he stayed where he was, his danger would be just as great. Among the trees something was growing low on the ground in long rows. It must have been planted there to grow in such straight lines, and someone might come along to tend to it. Something brightly coloured, not yellow nor red, but both at once, caught his eye in the green grass. It was round and rather soft. David picked it up without thinking and walked the last few yards to the road. The morning was still young, and everywhere was quiet in the sunlight. There was no one to be seen. He crossed the road, not slowly nor hurriedly. Afterwards, when his heart had stopped beating so fast, he realised that his decision had changed everything. Ever since the night he had found the bundle lying under the tree, as the man had told him it would be, his feet had carried him along, deciding the way for him. This time it was he who made the decision. His feet had not wanted to take the risk of crossing the road, and he had mastered them and forced them to do it. The thought gave David a warm feeling of strength and freedom. From now on he would think for himself and make his own decisions, and his feet and hands and body would be his servants to do his bidding. Right down by the edge of the water he had sheltered from the road, and the nearest house was some way off. David did not think anyone would be able to see him from there, but he was sure and it was necessary to be sure he could get over to that rock. He would be in a kind of cave with 2 walls and a bit of road. But it was too far for him to jump across. David put his bundle down and stretched his legs over the edge, feeling about with his foot for some support, but it was very steep and slippery. Only a yard separated him from the best hiding place he had ever seen. "I will get over," he said to himself. "It must be possible. There must be some way." Perhaps he could find a big stone and drop it into the cleft so that he could clamber across. But struggle as he would, he could not budge the only boulder that looked big enough. If he had a rope, but there was nothing he could make it to last it fast to the other side, and the only thing he had that at all resembled a rope was a bit of string around his trousers.